What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So yesterday morning, we got a report that, if I'm being honest, isn't that shocking. It might be shocking to some people, but I think the writing was on the wall that Nikolai Ehlers is going to be available for trade. The Jets are going to shop him in the lead up to the draft. This comes to us from the Winnipeg Jets athletic reporter. This guy is pretty plugged in. It's not like it's some random source. And when looking at Ehlers, it kind of makes sense. When looking at it, the writing was on the wall, in my opinion, because although he is a very talented player, he didn't play that much for the Winnipeg Jets this year. He had an average ice time of 15:54, which maybe you think, okay, Scheifele, Connor play more. No, Adam Lowry, their captain, who is a good player, don't get me wrong, played more than Ehlers, and more glaringly, more shockingly, Mason Appleton had a higher ice time than Nikolai Ehlers this year. So he just wasn't getting used properly. And when looking at him over recent years, it has been a bit of a dip in production since that COVID year, 46 points in 47 games. He was in my top 50 players in the entire NHL. His ice time has kind of staggeredly gone down, and as a result, the production has. But even last year, 38 points in 45 games. This guy is a very good player, but for some reason, Winnipeg bonus just didn't want to utilize him that much. So it makes sense that maybe they can get something on the open market. Maybe they can trade him for a defenseman after how bad their defense was. And this guy's also a stud analytically. I just want to point this out. It's not like he's just he's mainly an all offense guy, but he does produce at a very high rate. This was him the last 6-7 years. This was him most recently. His defensive numbers actually were far better this season. This guy's a premier winger. This guy is a premier winger, and I think in the right situation with actual solid center play, because he didn't really play with Scheifele, he could be a legit 70 to 80 point guy. I don't think the Winnipeg Jets should trade him, but if you're not going to utilize him, I guess it does make some sense to trade him. So with that said, I asked you guys on my Instagram to send me your Ehlers hypothetical trades. So we are going to go through them right now. I have 15 loaded up. You guys sent in like over 100. I greatly appreciate it. So we're going to dive into it. For the most part, these are all different teams. I think there's maybe 2 repeats of the same team, but we're going to go through them right now. I'm going to tell you what I overall think of them. Up first to the Oilers. Nuge for Ehlers, 1-for-1 sign and trade. Well, wouldn't exactly, I guess the extension would be a sign. Ehlers isn't a pending RFA. He has 1 year left at $6 million. I forgot to point that out. When looking at a Nuge for Ehlers deal, I think it would make sense if they were on roughly the same contract. If Nuge had 3 years left at his current cap hit, which is like $5.125 million, and Ehlers also had 3 years, I think that could work. I think Ehlers probably is a better player than Nugent Hopkins, despite the production maybe doesn't show that. He just doesn't have the talent that Nugent Hopkins has around him. But when you factor in the fact that Nugent Hopkins has like 4 or 5 more years at his current cap hit of $5.125 million, even though Nuge is 3 years younger than Ehlers, I think considering he has so much term left, it's such an insane cap hit versus Ehlers. If you trade for him, he's going to want, rightfully so, at least $8 million, $7.5, $8 million immediately on an extension. If he balls out, if he goes into a contract year and balls out, that could be 8.5. I think the Oilers say no to that. Nuge is... They have more glaring problems than, say, their wingers. They got to fix the goaltending, maybe the defense with the Nurse and CC pair. I get what you're going for. They're roughly the same player for the most part, but considering the contracts, Nuge is one of the best contracts in the entire league. Next up, Jake DeBrusk in a second for Ehlers. I like this one a decent amount when looking at Boston. Before these playoffs, DeBrusk kind of looked expendable. Looked like they were going to let him hit the open market. Now he has some value. He definitely has some value. So if you're Winnipeg and you think we can lock up DeBrusk after a great playoffs on a 4-year deal at $5.5 million, get off Ehlers and get a second-round pick, I think this is a very, very good deal for both sides. I think that this might be the best, arguably the best trade that I saw out of all of these. I really like that for both sides. I think Boston does get a more talented winger, a winger that can be that 75, 80 point guy that can play with Pasta and help their overall weakness at center position, can kind of make up for that with good winger play. I really like that potential trade. Columbus, Jiricek in a third. This is a very interesting one. I could see Columbus doing this. Jiricek, although he's still very young, a little bit of a concern this year, bumping down from the AHL to the NHL. He criticized the team. If Columbus loves a defenseman at 4th overall, maybe Jiricek becomes expendable. If they love a Zane Parik, if Artem Leshinov falls to them at 4th overall, maybe they kind of pull the trigger on this kind of deal. Jiricek becomes expendable, and instead they want an elite winger, because Johnny Gaudreau really has not been an elite winger, for an Adam Fantilli type. I could see it then. But if they're planning to go forward with that 4th overall pick, I think you keep Jiricek. You have that defense core of Matachuk, Jiricek, and Werenski. But definitely interesting considering Jiricek's complaints this season about not being a full-time NHLer. I really like that potential hypothetical. Seattle, Jamie Oleksiak in a second. I don't really know what the rest is about, but Jamie Oleksiak in a second. I think if you turn that into a first, maybe we could have a potential debate on that. When looking at it, I think Oleksiak would be an upgrade for this Winnipeg Jets defense core, bringing in a big physical defenseman. We saw it against the Colorado series. They just got exposed for the most part. So I think there is some value in that. Jamie Oleksiak, maybe you need a slightly better defenseman, but I see the vision with that. Marco Rossi, I believe that's Carson Lambos in a 2025 first round pick. I think you could bump this down to a second round pick and probably get this done. When looking at Rossi, very impressive rookie year, 21 goals, 17 assists or something around the lines of that, around 20 and 20 guy at only 21 years old, 22 years old. I think this would be a very good deal for the Winnipeg Jets. Do I see them trading with like their technical rival, the Minnesota Wild? Probably not, but I do think that is a very interesting deal and value-wise does about round up. Rossi should eventually be a very, very good second line center, 30 and 30 guy. Maybe he won't be as good as Ehlers, but you tack on that first or second round pick and it makes sense. And if you're Minnesota, the only problem is, well, Minnesota, they could fit it this year, probably the cap space. Well, actually, yeah, their money comes up the following year, so they would be able to fit out an Ehlers extension after that year. Might be a little bit tough this year, but going forward, they would have the money to do that. Next up, Ehlers to Vancouver for Hronek in a pick. Hronek, it's kind of tough because when looking at it, Canucks fans have kind of soured on him. The thing with the Canucks, if they're going to trade his RFA rights, I think they're going to want a defenseman back. I don't think that you're going to acquire another smallish winger. Well, they don't have that many smallish wingers, but when looking at it, I don't think that they're going to bring in a guy like Ehlers for Hronek. I think they're going to probably go for a defenseman if they're going to. I think they probably are just going to lock him up. He's not going to cost what he did before the end of the regular season. He kind of has been exposed to a degree, but I don't really see them acquiring a winger for him, if that makes sense. Next up, Mangiapane in a first and a second. When looking at Mangiapane, he also has 1 year left at $5.8 million. I think this makes some sense. I don't know why Calgary would be going like a kind of like a win now mode, trading an asset as well as Mangiapane, but I think from a value perspective, it could make some sense. Winnipeg could trade for him and then immediately lock him up on like a 5x5 if they believe in him. He's probably not gonna get 5.8 yet again after having a down year, but a slightly worse winger than Ehlers and a pick attached to it makes some sense for both parties. A Mitch Marner trade. Marner, Ehlers, Perfetti, DeMello, first, third to Toronto for Marner. I think you can honestly scrap that first round pick for sure. I think that's a massive overpayment for the Winnipeg Jets. If you're adding a first to it, if you're just keeping it without the first, I think that could make sense. Winnipeg made some massive splash for a two-way guy. Ehlers is more so just an offensive guy. It would cost a lot. Perfetti, I don't know what his long-term future is with the team after getting benched in the first 4 games of the Colorado Avalanche series. That's definitely a splash move. Would Marner waive his no movement clause for Winnipeg? I'm not so sure, but it's definitely an interesting one. Isaac Rosen, a 2024 second and a 2025 second as well. When looking at this, it makes some sense. Isaac Rosen did do very good in the AHL. If Winnipeg's scouting department is very high on him, it does make some sense. He probably can play in the NHL next year. I think next year he should be ready to go. He was drafted, in 2021 or 2020? So when looking at Rosen, if they believe that he can come in and make an immediate impact, you can maybe do that. 2 second-round picks is very fair value to make up for the talent gap right now. I think that's a pretty solid deal. Jacob Chikrin for Ehlers. When looking at this, I think that this can make a lot of sense as well. If Ottawa thinks that we're going to lock in a defenseman at 7th overall, let's get rid of Chikrin. I think an Ehlers deal would make a lot of sense. The cap hits are roughly the same, 4.6 for Chikrin, $6 million for Ehlers. I think that this is a very solid two-way swap. And if you're Winnipeg, you're looking for that number 2 defenseman behind the Josh Morrissey. It would be tough to factor in an extension, but they previously thought they might extend Ehlers, so maybe use some of that money to extend to Jacob Chikrin. I really like this. Thank you, James. I forgot to say everybody's name at the end. I'll run through everybody's name, but this one was pretty funny. Callum Tanner, Minnesota gives Ogren Hartman in a 2024 6th-round pick. Winnipeg gives Ehlers. I don't know if he was in on this, but I don't think Ryan Hartman's going to be a Winnipeg Jet, considering what he did to Cole Perfetti with that high stick. I don't think the Winnipeg fan base would be too elated to bring in a guy like Ryan Hartman on their team. I feel like that relationship might be broken long term. We got another Marner one. Ehlers, Pionk in a first. I think that this could make some sense when looking at it. The cap hits would match up roughly. Pionk, honestly, is probably like a negative value contract, but he's maybe could fit. Maybe Brad Treliving likes what he sees in a Neil Pionk, and so the money matches up. And also, Winnipeg kind of gets off a bad contract at $5.9 million next year for Pionk. The first round pick might be bumped down to a second again. I don't think there's definitely a gap between Ehlers and Marner, but at the respective cap hits of $6 million next year versus 10.9, that makes it a lot closer. That makes it about equal probably in terms of value. So another pretty interesting Mitch Marner one. The Chicago Blackhawks, Ehlers for 2025 second, 2026 second, Sam Savoy, and a 2026 Senators fourth. I think the Winnipeg Jets are going to need a roster player. I do like the idea of Chicago. But actually, no, this is the Chicago one I wanted to show. Chicago, the 2024 20th overall. Taylor Hall at 50% retained. I don't think that they'd have to include the 2026 first round pick. So the 20th overall pick this year and Taylor Hall at 50% retained for a guy like Ehlers. I think that could be interesting. Hall is obviously coming off a torn ACL that is nothing to joke with, but if they got him at half retained and Chicago can retain money, God knows that at this point. Well, what, $2.5 million, I think, roughly? I think that would be a pretty decent bet for the Winnipeg Jets on top of adding a pretty blue chip prospect at 20th overall to bolster their core. I think that would definitely be an interesting one for the Winnipeg Jets because Ehlers, although he's a very good player, hopefully in the coming years they can replace him with a Brad Lambert, with a Colby Barlow, Rucker McGrody. He's not essential to, although I think he's a fantastic player and they should prioritize him. They get them getting another 20th overall pick and a guy, and a veteran like Taylor Hall that can still produce at a decent level. His underlying numbers are solid, was just in Chicago. Definitely an intriguing deal. And then lastly, we got this from Ben. Ehlers in a third for Natchez in a late round pick. This one got floated out a lot. The only problem I have with this is Winnipeg would have to give Natchez an extension right away. That extension would probably be even more than Nikolai Ehlers. I like it though. I think those are two players of around the same value. I think Ehlers is the better player, but if you're Winnipeg and you want to move off this guy, you get a younger guy. He's what, 4 years younger than, definitely 3 years younger than a Nikolai Ehlers, and you can maybe lock him up on a long-term extension or at $6.57 million. He can be a solid 65 to 70 point guy. Definitely an interesting hypothetical for the Winnipeg Jets. But that's it. Those are all of them. I'm going to run through them again to give credit to all these guys and Kitch. B. Porter 203, Matthias Araka, could be Clint, Adam Luke Nash, Canucks fan, Monj Season, Kalev 86, Mika Zabinachat, that's a good one, LeBlanc James, Callum Tanner, Yessi, I'm going to botch that, Koramaki, Jack Brownlee, Marcus Silva, and Ben Huffman. Thank you to everybody that suggested trades, that sent in trades. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know in the comments, what do you think the best hypothetical was? What would your ideal hypothetical for Nikolai Ehlers be? And I'll be seeing you in the next one. And potentially bald in the next one. The Rangers and the Hurricanes play tonight.